Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. Thanks for being here. Today is going to be another video where I'm answering the most asked subscriber questions that I've encountered over the last year of talking to hundreds of elk hunters every week. The next question that I'd like to address that I think that is really important to a lot of you guys is, how do I consistently find elk on highly pressured public land? It's a huge topic, right? Just more and more hunters all the time. Sometimes it just feels like you can't get away. And so the place that we start every hunt is trying to figure out where all the hunter access points are and how we can use that to our advantage. You didn't hear me say try to escape pressure. We want to use it to our advantage by predicting which country we can eliminate right off the bat. That's one of the biggest advantages of pressure, is you get to figure out all the places you don't want to hunt right away. And so then it narrows down your options, and narrowing down those options are good for you. You get to not waste your time in country that's going to be too easy for other guys to hunt. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to look where all those roads and trails converge, and we're going to try to use that to solidify our knowledge of where the most likely pressure is going to come from. Then beyond that, we want to look at hunter habits. What does the terrain look like coming in and out of these access points? Is it too easy for guys just to kind of stroll over a couple of ridges? Or is it really steep and nasty? And what is the best looking terrain for elk within those areas? So just because you have a trail system coming in doesn't mean that you have to hunt 10 miles away from that trail system. All it means is you have to find the places where hunters probably don't want to go off of that trail system, the places that are nasty looking pockets, security cover for elk. Their number one need is security and safety. And then figure out, if I were an elk, would it make sense for me to be there? Can I access food and water and then get into that security cover or never leave it, even though it's near a trail? Then that's starting to look pretty good for me as an elk. And so that's what's going to look good for me as a hunter. An example that I like to give is, let's say somebody gave you an elk decoy, right? I give you an elk decoy and I say, all right, here's an elk decoy. It has a sensor in it for when somebody successfully finds it, right? We're going to say kills it, right? But successfully finds it. And your job is to hide this elk so that nobody can find it, all right? You have to be at least a half a mile off of any trail or road, but you can be no more than 3 miles from a trail or a road. So it's got to be between those two zones right there. On top of that, you have to be up and feeding out in some type of feeding area. You can't just stay in one spot all the time. You've got to move that decoy a little bit where it has to feed for at least an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. Right? The rest of the time, you get to hide it tucked in wherever you want. When you look at your map, where are you going to place that elk? That is a really cool way of being able to look at your area and break this down and try to figure out, if I were an elk, where would I go? Or where should I hunt? Because some of that doesn't need to be all that remote. Guys talking about going 10 miles in. I mean, if you don't have horses, it's just not realistic for getting that elk out. I mean, I was one to say when I was younger, like, if you told me there were elk somewhere, I had no problem going there to kill it, right? But the problem is, then you start getting into some of those nasty pack outs and you realize, well, the limiting factor is not whether you can get in there and kill them necessarily, even though obviously that's a challenge, but the factor becomes, the limiting factor becomes, can I get this elk out and not waste any meat, right? That's the huge piece of the puzzle. And so finding the balance between those two. So for me, I don't want to go 5 miles if I don't have to. If I could kill him a half mile off the road, great, because I can find a nasty, steep security pocket. That is money, right? That's gold. So think about that scenario a little bit. Where are you going to put your decoy so that nobody can find that bugger? Because if you do, let's say you get $1 million. It's that important. Where would you hide that sucker? That is going to change your perspective on where to look. And that changes everything about how we look to try to find elk consistently in that pressured public land. I think it's also pretty important to note the hierarchy of needs here, especially on public land. A lot of times I will talk to folks who prioritize feed. And in my opinion, an elk's number one priority, like I mentioned earlier, is security. It's safety. It's those secure pockets. That's the number one priority. So the feed and water certainly becomes secondary to that security need. Elk, in my experience, will oftentimes give up the best feed if they can stay safe, right? They'll make do with what's around them. There's a lot of food, even in those dark north-facing timber pockets in there in a lot of places, and they'll make do with it, even if it's not the prime food that they can get somewhere else, if they can stay safe and secure. So it's important to understand those priorities. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post-Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Now, let's say you narrow down some security pockets. Could be a half mile off the trail, could be 2 miles, 3 miles, whatever, doesn't matter. You nail down some security pockets that you think are higher probability areas to go look for elk. The biggest mistake at this point that a lot of folks make is they go busting in there and they pressure the heck out of it. They add pressure to that security pocket. What does that do? Unless you're extremely lucky, pressuring in there without a good plan, it's just going to push those elk to a different security pocket, right? And so once we know where we're going to go with the security pocket in mind, with the balancing of all those elk needs, they can escape. It's someplace that humans probably don't want to go. When you find those areas, you've got to treat them like they're gold, even if you haven't confirmed that there are elk in there yet. So I would not rush in there. I don't want to just rush in there and start calling aggressively or still hunting through it. I want to try to look at that bugger and determine, all right, is this pocket most likely to hold elk all day long? Or are there different pieces of terrain to it? Because we're not talking about 5 acres, right? Could be, but we're probably talking about a larger chunk of ground or chunk of timber or timber connected to a drainage or whatnot. But there's some type of barrier for humans, for hunters, that makes it hard for them to access it. So we've got that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just 100% nastiness in there, 100% dark, because that's not going to meet all the elk's needs all the time either. They're going to have to come in and out of that kind of stuff. So when we look at that chunk of ground, how can we best approach it? Within that chunk of ground, is there a transition zone? Is there an area where they're more likely to feed and then transition to bed and then bed transition back to feed? Then we would hunt that transition zone. And that might not mean right at that minute when you go over there, right? It might just mean that you need to plan out that part of the hunt even better. Maybe it's a midday where they might be headed to a spring in the middle of the timber, or maybe it's an area where you need to catch them in the transition. And because of wind, it's better either in the morning or the evening, right? So we're not just rushing caution in there. And if we are using calls, I'm playing it safer. And I've learned over 34 years of doing this that I want to play it safer personally anyway. A lot of aggressive calling is a lot of ego a lot of times. And I've been there and I've been guilty of it. However, these days, as an older, hopefully a little bit wiser hunter, I use calling in more of a minimal fashion. I only want to give as much sound out there and let them know that there's another elk out there as possible, as little as possible. I'm going to use it sparingly. And the best elk hunters I know treat it the same way. Some of them don't call at all. Some of the best elk hunters I know don't call at all. The other ones that do call, the best ones that I personally know, are not out there just aggressively calling into every chunk of ground that they think might hold elk. They're playing it very strategically, very close to the chest. And on high pressured public land, that is exactly how I would play those elk. Very cautiously, less is more. Start with cow calls, see what kind of response you get, if any. If you get responsive bulls, obviously we can go into the backbone system for calling those bulls that I have full videos on. But I would start on the minimal side of calling 100% when I'm approaching those high pressured pockets. Now, I think a huge piece of your planning here needs to also include having multiple security spots marked on your map. Lots of those little security pockets to check out. And the more efficient you can be about that, the better, where you're trying to be able to attack one and then another and then another. And so, a lot of times what I'll use as an example for folks is fishing, or fly fishing in particular. If you walk up to the edge of a stream or river or lake, usually the first cast is not to try to cast all the way across it and line the fish, right? Usually the first cast is very close, and then we're out there a little bit further, and then we're out there a little bit further. Now we're into the middle of it. And so I use that same approach in elk hunting. I don't necessarily just blow through a whole bunch of country going 2 miles deep. I work in increments. And if I'm unsuccessful, or the sign is telling me something, or sound is telling me something, or hunter pressure is telling me something, then I adjust. And then I might need to go a little bit further and a little bit further and a little bit further. So that's the way that I plan out hunting those security pockets as well. And pressure throughout the season may change how you use those security pockets. It may reshape the distribution. You may think that it's going to be one way, and all of a sudden you realize that some hunters came in from a ridge and already pressured one of those pockets. Or you might realize that your own route, because of wind, messed up some of those pockets approach, and you might have to adjust how you're going to circle in there and make those work for you and see if there are any elk in there. So just realize that that can change. It's not always going to be black and white. It's not going to be clear cut. There is no always and never in elk hunting. We're constantly going to have to adjust. We're probably going to have to adjust to pressure throughout that season. So if you've been around my videos for any amount of time, you know that I like to simplify things. I like to boil it down to simple processes that help take away a lot of the guesswork, a lot of the anxiety and pressure that we feel, analysis paralysis when we're looking at stuff. And so this is another great example of that. So when we break this down into that kind of system, we're going to first be looking at pressure, the hunter pressure. Where are they accessing this country from? Where are those trails and roads dumping out? And then how are those hunters accessing the country from those access points? All of that adds up to pressure. Then we're going to look for those security pockets. And the security pockets are first determined by the barrier to entry. They might not be very far away from those trails and roads, but maybe they're steep and nasty to be able to get into. And guys just don't want to do them, at least especially the second half of the season where they've done that and don't want to do it again. So we're looking for those security pockets, and we're trying to figure out whether those security pockets, after they cause a barrier of entry for hunters, are also going to meet the elk's needs. Those are the first two steps in the process. Step number 3 is we're going to make sure that we can confirm sign, or we're going to approach those in a way that doesn't blow those pockets out. We're going to make sure that we're positioning ourselves correctly with the wind. We're going to make sure that we're trying to have minimal invasiveness into that area. We're not just marching into it, right? We're not pressuring our way through it. We're using minimal calling to be able to test it out and get a feel for how those bulls are going to respond in there. And then we're going to adjust as the season goes on, to the pressure, to our plan, to all those security pockets, making sure that we do really have the best access to them with strong wind, and we're taking into account sign as we work through the season. You know, where are the elk at right now? Has the hunter pressure changed? Are other guys figuring some of this out? Where are the elk congregating now? They tend to get pushed back further and further sometimes as the season goes on. So are you following those patterns and that behavior? Now, if all of this has seemed a little bit overwhelming to you and you want help finalizing your plan going into season, I would encourage you to hop on backboneunlimited.com and get one of my elk hunt plan audits scheduled with me. What you're going to get with that is I'm going to send you a questionnaire and you're going to fill out detailed, very detailed information about your area, about your hunt plan, and then I'm going to give you a 30+ page report back that helps analyze what you're doing right, maybe what you're doing wrong, and what kind of improvements you could make so that you have a really solid outline of things to work on going into your season. And we're going to then schedule a call so that I can clarify any questions about that you have, any new questions that you might have about it. Going to give you all kinds of goodies that maybe you haven't thought about your area and ways that you can approach it so that you feel super confident going into season. The next thing that I think that I can help you with is daily accountability, daily access to me, helping you work through a lot of your questions and plan for your hunt. And we do that through team access on Team Backbone. And so I'd encourage you to join me there. You're going to get firsthand lots of content, lots of my written content. You're going to be able to reach out to me on a daily basis. So join me on Team Backbone there. If you haven't already and you feel like you need to have a better understanding of elk behavior, of terrain, of these security pockets, of how to make a plan and strategize and put it all together, I would highly encourage you to grab my 328-page elk hunting series. That ebook is going to do wonders for you if you feel like you're still in kind of the first half of your elk hunting journey. It's going to do wonders for building your base knowledge. And then, of course, if you are still struggling with any kind of training or nutrition going into season, or you want help with your on-hunt nutrition plan, I've got 30+ years of experience as a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach, and I would love to help you out there. You know, probably the most important piece of all this, and my favorite part, is the fact that this video was built on subscriber questions. I love to connect with you guys in the comments, so please hit me up there. If you have questions that you'd like to see addressed in a video, let me know. If you have other questions that I can just answer in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Love to hear about your struggles and your successes, absolutely. So let me know in the comments. I read and respond to all of them. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.